on talkRADIO.
Good morning and welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on talkRADIO. So, it was it not, the usual depressingly predictable stuff from Boris Johnson. The Brothers Grimm were, of course, in attendance, flanking the glummest Prime Minister we've seen since the last time he had some bad news to impart. The old shine seems to have gone off the honeymoon period, doesn't it? He was looking great at the G7. Now he's actually back to business, back to the real world, back to work, rather than eating turbot in the fountains of the Garden of Eden, whatever it was, that Eden Project nonsense he was messing about with, getting the red arrows flying around. That's what Boris likes. He loves all the pageantry, loves all the kind of, statesmanship, loves all the glad handing with the President of the United States of America, makes himself feel important. It's all lovely. Instead of that, though, he comes back to the reality of what I can only describe, I'm afraid, as a tissue of lies. A complete and utter, as he would say, pyramid of piffle when it comes to the data, not the dates, because the data purely and simply shows that even the models that were made earlier on this year by the sage crowd of pessimists are completely wrong. But even their models said if it was worse than it is now, you could still lift the lockdown on June the 21st. We had Dan Hodges in the first hour who says we're not in lockdown. I put it to him that if we're not in lockdown, why are we still in restricted situations? Because that surely means the lockdown didn't work. We're going to talk in this hour to Toby Young, General Secretary, of course, of the Free Speech Union, also editor of Lockdown Skeptics. I'm sure he will have a thing or two to say about whether July the 19th is going to give us any hope either. I'm sick to death of being told data, not dates, and then moving to dates, because there's no reason why next Monday should not be Freedom Day. 0344 499 1000. Jamie Jenkins joins us as well in this hour with some proper honest-to-goodness data that he's been crunching. He'll tell us what the real truth is about what's going on. 0344 499 1000. More of your calls as well. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. It is, of course, talkRADIO.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. talkRADIO.
Time to say a very good morning to Toby Young. How are you doing, Toby?
I'm good, Mike. How are you?
Very well indeed. Very well indeed. Interesting conversation with Dan Hodges earlier where he described the fact that he didn't think we're anymore in lockdown. To which I said, well, obviously it didn't work then, did it? Because apparently we are not yet free.
Yeah, that's a strange thing to say. We clearly are still under a huge number of restrictions. The restrictions that we understood were going to be lifted on June 21st. The rule of six still applies in restaurants and bars. The limits on outdoor gatherings still apply, unless apparently you're getting married. I think lots of people are rather unexpectedly going to be getting married after June 21st, Mike, because it's the only way they'll be able to have outdoor gatherings of more than 30.
Yes. Maybe Boris doesn't hold marriage to be particularly difficult to do, and therefore he's encouraging that, and then you just get divorced and get married again next weekend.
Maybe. I think what Boris said essentially yesterday, Mike, was that he wants us to give him 4 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
And we've heard that before, haven't we?
We have.
I think it was on March 23rd last year, we were told that we just have to endure these restrictions for 3 weeks. It would be 3 weeks to flatten the curve. In fact, the lockdown wasn't lifted until July. We were told the reason for locking down in December was to save Christmas. Well, Christmas wasn't saved. In the end, the restrictions weren't lifted as they were promised around the Christmas period. I think Matt Hancock, in an interview with Fraser Nelson and James Forsyth at The Spectator, said that once all the vulnerable had been vaccinated, once those most vulnerable to this disease had been vaccinated, we could lift all the restrictions. And he used the phrase, cry freedom. Well, Mike, I think a better phrase would have been cry wolf, because that's what this government's been doing for the last 15 months.
Well, I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago that they said that people would have to curtail their holidays in Portugal, the only place they could actually go on a green list that was worth going to, in order to save June the 21st. I mean, that was the reason. The reason was, well, we need to really safeguard the domestic reopening of the economy. And what happened to that?
What happened to that? I think all of these things suggest that we really can't take the date of July 19th to the bank.
No.
Even Boris yesterday, he seemed to speak with two faces, not altogether unusually. But one of the faces said, this will be a terminus. we're not talking about a nice to have lifting the restrictions on July 19th. That is a stop date. That will be final. And then in the next breath said, unless we have a new variant, which is even more dangerous than the Indian variant, Delta variant,
yes.
in which case all bets are off. It's like, well, hang on a second. Is it a terminus or is it a way station?
Right.
He didn't seem to know himself.
Well, I'm afraid it's now come down to what's happened to me this morning, which was that they've shut one of the roads around where I live. So when I went out to get a bus for the first time in about 2 weeks, I found out there wasn't a bus anymore because it's been rerouted. So I don't know whether the terminus analogy is a good one. But let's have a listen and a watch at Boris, because he might as well let him explain in his own words why he's doing this.
19th, 2/3 of adults aged, all adults in the country would have had 2 doses by the end of so by July the 19th, we will have all adults.
There you go. It's clear as mud, isn't it, Toby?
Now, even by Boris's standards, that was poor. I mean, here's the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, admitting that he's not going to be able to keep his promise about unlocking on June 21st, trying to reassure the public that there is a very good reason for this and that we only need to postpone the unlocking for 4 weeks. It was as though he didn't even believe it himself.
Right.
Stumbling over his words, realised that it was just all errant nonsense, couldn't bring himself to even say it because it was so obviously rubbish. I'm joking about this with you, Mike, but actually it's profoundly depressing.
It's terribly depressing. Listen, Julie and I today were sort of almost in tears with frustration about this whole situation.
I woke up this morning feeling really, really gloomy.
Yeah.
I really thought that June 21st was going to be it. I didn't think Boris could U-turn on that one, and the reasons presented for it were largely incomprehensible. We're going to be publishing a detailed critique of Next Slide Please Chris Whitty's presentation on lockdown skeptics by a senior former NHS doctor shortly. But one slide that was missing from that presentation, Mike, was the slide showing hospital occupancy, which is completely flat. It may be that admissions into hospitals, particularly in the northwest, of people with COVID-19 have increased from a very, very low base. He rattles off those percentages, but not the raw numbers, because the percentages disguise the fact that the raw numbers are still tiny. Think something like less than 1% of total hospital admissions are people being admitted for COVID-19. But not only that, not only did he try and disguise how few people are now being admitted to hospital with COVID-19 by talking about percentages rather than raw numbers, he didn't talk about the length of stay. The people being admitted to hospital with COVID-19, even with the Indian variant, are predominantly under 45 and can fight it off quite quickly. Give them a bit of oxygen, keep them in intensive care for a couple of days and then send them home, which is why occupancy hasn't increased. It's still a flat line.
Exactly.
There really is no reason not to reopen on the 21st. If the reason is protecting the NHS at this particular point doesn't need protecting.
No.
And incidentally, if he's worried about the NHS being overwhelmed, the excuse that's been trotted out every time they extend a lockdown or impose a lockdown, why didn't any of the journalists say, well, in that case, Boris, why did you close the Nightingales? The Nightingales were supposedly built to create some excess capacity in the event of pressure being placed on the NHS. Aren't you ashamed that having built them, you've now closed them because now apparently we're in the midst of another crisis? The NHS is on the brink of being overwhelmed again and we're all going to have to remain under lock and key for another 4 weeks.
Yes.
I mean, not one journalist asked him that. I mean, we all know that the Nightingales were a completely meaningless PR stunt, but it would have been good to put him on the spot nevertheless.
Well, it would have been, but I'm afraid the standard of questioning hasn't got any better since they stopped doing these things on a fairly regular and almost daily basis. But let's look at some other figures here, right? Average daily deaths. I'm happy the Telegraph now does this every single day. Average daily deaths from all causes, right? 1,375. Change in daily 7-day average of cases, plus 45.5%. But the number of deaths from COVID, 3. So that means 3 people died from COVID, 1,372 people died of something else. I mean, I rest my case, my lud.
It's completely absurd. And if you look at the excess mortality for this time of year, it's below the baseline for the last 5 years. It's been mortality has been below the 5-year average, I think, for the past 12 weeks. We're much better off than we usually are in terms of people dying. So there really isn't any good reason for postponing the ending of the lockdown. Do you think we need to engage in some sort of campaign of mass civil disobedience, Mike? Is it becoming increasingly clear that we're not going to be given our freedoms back? The only way we're going to get them back is if we take them back.
Yeah.
What about a Boston Tea Party style objection in Boston, in Lincolnshire, in which a large group of people hurl their face masks into the local river? We call it the Boston Mask Party.
Well, you don't even have to go as far as Boston. Can you not just do it outside the Houses of Parliament and chuck them all the terrace?
I think people should just point blank refuse to wear face masks after June 21st. If when you get up from your table in a restaurant or a pub, you're told to put on your mask, I think you politely say to the waiter, how can the virus tell whether I'm sitting down or standing up?
Yes.
If they can't answer that question, say, I'm sorry, this rule is so absurd, I'm simply not going to comply with it.
But I go to a lot of places now where that's not even happening anymore, and lots of people are not bothering.
I think you see it. You are seeing civil disobedience unfolding naturally in a disorganised way, but on a mass scale, I think. And that's only going to increase, which is another reason it's completely pointless to postpone the unlocking. You're just damaging businesses. You're not actually going to make any difference to the amount of actual mobility in the country.
Yeah, because it's a bit like the old arguments we used to have about Brexit and the European Union. When the Remainers were all talking about how terrible it would be if we left, nobody ever said how bad is it going to be if we stay. How much more expansion will the EU get involved in? What we need to ask the questions of the government now are, what have you got planned next? Because I see again in the Telegraph that, Whitty thinks it's a great idea to then start giving the vaccine to kids. You've been involved in schooling organisations in the past, Toby. This is an outrage, because if we don't stop them at some point, the next thing will be, okay, now send your kid to school on Monday between the hours of 9 and 10. They'll be getting vaccinated before they put their masks on.
Well, they'll be getting vaccinated between the hours of 9 and 10, and then they'll have to go home because the school would have been closed because one child tested positive using the shonky Innova test, which even the CDC in America has advised people to throw in the bin because they're so unreliable. These are the tests we're relying on to determine whether school children are infected. And this is the reason that entire year groups are being sent home for weeks at a time. Still, I got a message recently from someone whose child is at a school in Bristol. 3 year groups at that school have just been sent home this week for the entire week because a couple of kids tested positive using the Innova test. The headmistress, I think, didn't seem to be aware that, as I just said, the CDC, the equivalent of PHE in the United States, has just recommended that the Innova tests are so unreliable they should either be returned to the manufacturers, these are the lateral flow tests, or thrown in the bin. These are the tests that are being used to destroy children's education up and down the country. It's completely absurd. And don't think for a second that in the unlikely event that they do get permission and they make the political decision to vaccinate children, that will mean that schools won't close anymore. Because after all, 80% of people in the country have now got immunity to this disease, whether through vaccination, natural immunity, having got the disease and recovered from the disease, or prior immunity. 80%, that exceeds the herd immunity threshold. And still we're talking about restrictions. Still we're not letting people go to football games. We're not letting people have parties. So don't think for a second that if they vaccinate kids, that will mean that kids still aren't sent home. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Nothing we do, no matter how diligently we comply with the government's advice and enthusiastically inject substances into our arms, they still won't let us out of our homes.
I know. Incredible. I had a call just in the last hour from a listener whose son at 13 has been sent home because somebody in his class has tested positive on one of those tests, right? He's been sent home self-isolated, but his brother, who's 15, is still going to school. Even though he's in the same house as the kid who has to self-isolate. I said, well, surely if you got some kind of negative test, you could go back to school. No, that's not allowed. He has to stay off school for 10 days. He's going to miss his exams, which are all part of the assessment for year 9 and what he's going to do next. It's an absolute nonsense.
There's so much nonsense. So many of the rules lack any reason or logic. Noel Gallagher made a really good point. He was on a train without a mask on. And, you know, a Captain Mannering, or Warden Hodges, let's say, type, chastised him for not wearing a mask. That's
a good name for Dan, actually, Warden Hodges.
Warden Hodges. And the other passenger said, the only circumstances in which you're allowed to take your mask off on a train is if you're eating a sandwich. And Noel Gallagher said, oh, what? So the virus comes down the train carriage, does it, searching for potential targets, see someone without a mask, they're fair game. But if they've got a sandwich in their hand, they give them a free pass. I mean, it's just
It really is. But, I mean, the thing that staggers me, Toby, as I'm sure it does you, is the relatively sane people that you think are relatively sane who are eating this stuff up and buying it and going, but, well, you know what the rules are? It's like, well, yeah, I know what the rules are, but the rules are tosh.
It's a high status indicator, Mike. That's what it's all about. Saying that you support the government's approach to managing the coronavirus crisis, wearing masks in public, not just 1 or 2, but ideally 3, smearing and demonising anyone who dares to challenge the official narrative. It's all a way of signalling that you're a member of the club. You're an educated person. You're following the science. You're not one of these deplorable anti-vaxxers or conspiracy theorists. Yeah. It's all about that. It's about advertising your superior social status.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and that is clearly what is going on here. Toby, great to talk to you. Thank you very much. We'll continue the fight, and let's keep that Boston idea up our sleeve. It may well happen. Toby Young, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, Lockdown Skeptics as well. Of course, he's the editor of that. We're going to take some calls because we need to hear from the voices of common sense out there, i.e. all of you. This is Talk Radio.